claimed that we had all this gear, no problem at all, we'd be able to...
Can you help me move the table that way?
Oh, yeah, we're looking forward to this.
I'm trapped behind it.
Tell us about
Thanks.
spying on animals, basically, and what they use and why, and the problems they have with it.
Yep.
Okay.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming to listen. I thought I'd just give a quick talk on the tracking technology that we use in our research. I'm a biologist, so I spend a lot of time, as you say, spying on possums and wallabies. And so I'll just go through the sorts of questions we ask and some of the technology that we use to answer it. One of the questions that I'm interested in is, more generally, how do animals use their environment? And specifically, I'm going to talk about possums tonight because that's where we've done most of our tracking. The sorts of things we're interested in: where do possums go in space? So how do they use their landscape? And where do they go in time? And obviously, as a biologist, I'm most interested not just in where they go, but why they go there. But that question is really for another day. We're interested in it in a whole range of spatial scales and temporal scales, from large to small. So we might be interested in the home range, where over weeks or months an animal might use where it moves in the landscape. We might be interested in the particular areas, core areas, where they might spend 50% of their time. And down to the very small scale, which is just their feeding patches as they're going through the landscape, literally minute by minute. Where do they spend their time? And we're particularly, so hours even down to minutes. We're particularly interested in questions such as, does predation risk or fear affect where they go? And we usually get at these questions either before the days of cameras, we couldn't even answer it except by putting food out and seeing what was left. And now we film them to understand what they're doing while they're at feeding patches. And this possum, for example, first of all, the young are absolute scatterbrains. They don't perceive predation risk at all. They're never scared. But the adults, we answer these questions by, for example, putting feeders on the ground or putting them above ground. And with motion-triggered cameras, we film what they do when they come to those feeding stations. So we can ask questions, I won't go into the details, ask questions about which type of feeder, where those feeders are located that they're most likely to prefer feeding in. And our results show that the perceived cost, we really measure food in an inedible matrix, and when the animals give up, it gives us an indication of how they perceive the cost of that patch. When we do that, we ask them effectively, where would you prefer to feed? They prefer to feed above ground because their perceived cost is lower above ground. And that makes sense for possums because they're animals that live in trees. And when they're on the ground, they're more vulnerable to foxes or dogs or cats or even perhaps owls. So we film animals at feeders. What we don't know, unless we can uniquely identify them, for example, our primitive method is just shaving little patches in them so we can see what patches have gone from their fur. We don't know who avoids the feeders because we only film above them, so are there some possums who never even come? And we also don't know, unless we can uniquely identify them, who comes to which feeders. We've tried various things. We've glued, nice little bits of perhaps different shaped things, but they rub them off really quickly. So we can't answer those questions without either the use of GPS, where we know exactly where each animal has gone, or perhaps with Bluetooth, where we can have a proximity logger to see who's at that particular feeder at that particular time. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is in variation of how individuals use the landscape. And I've put this statement up here: individual possums have personality. If you've got dogs or cats, you all know they behave differently. We can actually quantify that with our wildlife too. And I'm interested in how animals of different inherent behaviours use the landscape differently. For example, shy possums more likely to stay above ground, a bold one's going to the ground, and so on. Just to give you a quick idea of how we look at those questions. First of all, these are just pictures off the web, but you can see a range in expressions, if you like. We don't just look at them and say, you're shy, you're bold. We actually look at it quantitatively and statistically. So we catch animals, put them in a small, it's actually a modified bookcase, but we film them for 5 minutes by doing repeat traps and measuring of these things and doing the appropriate stats, we can find out which animals behave consistently, or do they behave consistently differently. For example, one possum might consistently, no matter how often you put it in the bookcase, it will go to the top and not move. Another possum may be happy to explore that area. And statistically, we can rank them along a gradient of what we call personality traits, which really just reflects those differences among possums. Things like docility we use with this sophisticated wiggle test. You stick them in a bag and see how much they wiggle for a minute. And some animals wiggle consistently and some just sit in the bag. Activity is just how much they move through. You can see this possum in how much they spend moving within 5 minutes. Exploration we measure as they usually sit at the top, for example, their preferred area. How much of the time do they spend exploring other areas? And boldness is whether or not and how long they spend eating apple in that container, with the idea that if they're prepared to take risks, they're happy to eat in risky environments. So given that, the questions that we've been looking at that relate to tracking and GPS technology, is particularly Katie Watt, a PhD student of mine, who's just recently submitted. We ask these questions by putting radio collars on. So having quantified their personality in the bookcase, we then put collars on and see how they use that landscape. And the question is there any predictable relationships between their personality trait and how they use the habitat?
Why would we care?
Why would you care?
Yeah.
You probably don't. I'm interested because I'm interested in how they use it. I guess from a conservation perspective, if we try to conserve habitat based on the idea that all individuals have an average response and we create an average landscape, if actually animals survive in different ways, for example, some might use areas above ground and some might use areas below on the ground. I haven't seen a possum in the ground yet. It means that we're not actually catering for any possum. We may just be catering for a non-existent average possum. So I guess from a conservation perspective, that matters. I'm just inherently interested in it. This is out at Ku-ring-gai and North Turramurra.
Yeah, it's a nice
Yeah. So we've got a lot of work there. Now, how do we get at that question of the relationship between movement in time and space and individual animals? We have to catch the animals. You know, brushtail possums are about that size, so you can get a feel for the scale of it, and I didn't bring one along. We put GPS collars on them. We use a variety, but just to tell you a little bit about them, we've got old versions which were about $1,000 and new versions which were more expensive. Just a few details. So this was about $1,000 each. These are about $3,000 each. And you can see if one drops them in the chimney and you can't get them back, which has happened. One drops it in a hollow log or a dead tree out in the forest and we can't chop it down because it's a national park. There's another $3,000. It costs us a lot of money to lose information, and it's infuriating because there's a collar, we know it's got information on it, but we can't get it.
What's the information that you log with it?
Well, location mainly, so GPS locations.
Is that it?
Yeah, different collars do different things, so you can get accelerometers to look at which you have to standardise if you want to quantify behaviours. So, for example, are they sitting and chewing? Are they sleeping? Are they moving? But this is all location, in
So
time and location, and a low quality measure of height. We have restrictions from animal ethics perspective. If you put a heavy collar on an animal, it's going to cost something. So our rule of thumb is no more than 3% of the body weight. So for a possum, that means about 70 grams is our maximum, including the collar. Everything, nothing can weigh more. It can't weigh more than 70. The errors you can see are okay if you're looking at large-scale questions like home range. Who cares if it's out 15 metres? But if we're interested in that fine scale, where are they going minute by minute? In other words, what are the patches that they're using? The difference between an error of 15 metres and 5 is actually quite a lot. This one happens to be low energy use because they've gone broke, that company, or gone kaput anyway. It uses a technology of recording where the last GPS fix was, and then it turns itself off and turns itself on, I think, very quickly, and bases its new estimate of locations by fiddling with where it was 3 minutes ago. So they call it a snapshot sort of position, as distinct from every 3 minutes or whenever we set it, looking at all the satellites and getting a best fix by having the location information, by recording where they are for a long time, long enough to get a decent fix on it.
Is that information stored in the collar?
Yeah. And now the other thing we also need, because we need to get these collars back, we need to know where the animal is. And one of the biggest weights, that, as in heaviness, of all of these collars is that we use a VHF transmitter so that we can put up an aerial and hear it go beep, 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 and then we can know where our animal is, because we've got to trap it unless we have a quick release collar, which is actually not available for small animals like this at the moment. So that's a bit of information about, very limited information about these collars. To give you the sort of data, Katie's put together a map for me of 2 possums, the old and the new, so you can see the tight. So every, each of these lines represents a movement, or each of these fixes is 3-minute intervals at night when these are active. So you can see the intervals for this possum here with our new collar with quite relatively low errors. And you can see some bizarre movements, like can they possibly move 300 metres in 3 minutes? Probably not. I've never seen a possum run as fast as that through forest. And so we have to tidy up the data, but that gives you a feel for what
Is that, how many possums are there?
Well, the green is 1 possum and the yellow is a second possum. One night.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, so it starts they all live in the forest and they move to the houses to feed, and then they go back to their...
So whose roof are they living in?
Well, I can tell you.
We're going to get to that. I have a lot of questions on that.
Once we tidy up the information based on our estimate of what's, the maximum distance a possum can run in 3 minutes, our data looks more like that. But again, you can see the difference between the errors of our old collars and the errors with our new. Unfortunately, we lost one of our new collars down a chimney and couldn't get it back, even with a chimney sweep. But this gives you a feel for, over time, or 2-week interval, all the fixes that we can get. And this is literally female 1, female 2, female 3, and they have divvied up the houses. This happens to be a male, and as usual, males often have larger home ranges because they're seeking access to females as well as food. Females just concentrated on food. But you can see the large... Anyway, that's the raw data of the fixes within 2 weeks, and it's really nice because we can get a good feel for it. Then Katie, not me, uses some quite statistical packages to tidy that up and get contours of use, so we can get 90 where 90% use intervals are, where 50% intervals are, and so on.
What is showing is that possums are territorial.
That's right. They are, except they're all territorial. Females have some overlap. There's a few, but they tend to be quite distinct areas. Males have to overlap females, or there wouldn't be any more possums. So once we've tidied up that data, this gives you a feel for over time. So this is the number of the home range of individuals. So here, each colour represents an individual. So we tidy that up, we can quantify it, we can get an idea of size, overlap, and so on. So that's a large-scale information we can get from GPS collars. But we're also interested, as I said, in how they forage at the small scale, movement patterns literally over minutes. And if it works, what this will show you, again, 2 possums, 1 green and 1 yellow, and just show you how they move in time as well as space. Let's hope that works, because so you can sort of see, it's really interesting. I love just sticky beaking on these things. And that's a night's foraging sped up pretty quickly. So you can see we can get a feel for how long we can define these statistically, where these patches are, how long they spend in them and where they move.
So the yellow section is the house?
No, you mean it's nest, it's tree hollow. Yeah, so when the colour disappears, we don't get any reeds once they're in the trees. That blocks and so so you can see they actually came out of this tree hollow and she went back in there, that's the female, and the male sort of, I think, went back in somewhere there. So they have several trees that they will nest in. Given all that information, getting back to the biological question, which is, does personality affect home range size? The answer is yes. This is the relationship here. Our measure of exploration, there's a sex by personality interaction. So females, the more exploratory our females in that bookcase, the smaller their home range. Males, on the other hand, slightly larger home ranges if they're more exploratory. And again, we think that's related to the fact that females are going for food, and the males have to find the females, so they have to maintain large areas, irrespective of what they perhaps might like to do otherwise. Another relationship, we were interested in this boundary between forest and urban habitat, so we looked at the core area, which is the 50% contour of use. What proportion of that core area was, because all these possums lived on this edge, what proportion of that core area was in urban habitat? And again, that's correlated with exploration too. The more exploratory animals are more likely to have a large part of their core area in urban habitat. So that's quite interesting because it suggests there might be a difference in the personality of animals that are in the bush, or at least in that transition zone, that boundary zone, which is also interesting when we think about whether animals can be successful invaders of urban habitat, even with wildlife. Perhaps they have different behavioural traits. And one other piece of information that we haven't got from radio collars, we've got from their poo, is we can look at their scats and find out what they've eaten and know whether that food grows on the ground or up in the trees. And the probability of eating food on the ground is related to boldness, which actually is sort of makes sense because it is risky going to the ground, and the bolder animals have a higher probability of eating food that's on the ground. So it just means that there are predictable differences among individuals that we can predict based on these behavioural measures of their personality, and it affects how they use the landscape. So getting back, Philip, to your question about whether it matters, these aren't all average possums. They all treat the landscape and use the landscape in different ways. But we can't get accurate 3D height. You know, trees are 30 metres, the landscape goes like this. You can get a vague measure with our GPS collars of height, but it's not accurate enough for us to even ask the question, are they on the ground or are they above ground, which is something we'd be pretty interested in getting at. So our GPS collars help us untangle quite an intricate relationships, ecological interactions. They help us understand where animals move in time and space. We get at what they eat by their scats. And all of that can feed into, you know, where they're likely to survive and how effectively they reproduce long term. But we're never satisfied. As soon as the technology improves, we want more. And so I thought I'd come up with a list of my dream GPS collar. And what would it consist of? First of all, we'd use it for movement ecology. And just run through, I should have just put them all up. Not that I'm asking for much, not necessarily from you, but, you know, at $3,000 a pop, it's very expensive. We need a decent sample size to publish. We might need 17 to 40 possums. That's a huge amount of funding we have to find just to get the collars. We need them to be accurate and precise so that we know, so that we don't have all these points going like this, and accurate so we know exactly where they are and we can relate it to landscape variables. It's got to be lightweight for possum work because of ethical limitations. It has to be waterproof. We work in the bush, we don't work under a roof, so if it rains and the collar gets damp and we lose the information, there's $3,000 done in a different way. Ideally, we want we have these capacities already in some of our collars, reprogrammable time intervals, so that if we bring a collar back, we might be interested in one study in what's going on every 3 minutes. In another study, we might be interested in what goes on every hour. We're not interested in what they're doing during the day because it's a waste of battery and data because they're sitting in a tree hollow. So we might want to fix every 3 hours during the day, but multiple fixes during the night. That the battery lasts fit for purpose. So if we're getting lots of data, sure, we may only be able to get a week's worth of data, but we need to know we can get that week's data. The battery is rechargeable. Surtrac in New Zealand creates these wonderful collars, but it costs us 80% of the original cost to send it back and get it repotted and the battery recharged, because we can't recharge it. So there's 3,000 the first time, 2,000 the second time, 2,000 the third time, and so on. VHF or equivalent, so we can locate the possum. With the new collars, we can remotely download using ultra high frequency, but we do have to be close to the possum and know where it is. If we're 50 metres away, because of the trees, we can't locate them. Ideally, so that's what we can get at the moment, but it costs us. The things that are still, this technology is being developed all the time, and I'm not really asking you to necessarily to develop it, just to let you know the sorts of things we're interested in. 3D, we work in 3 dimensions, so obviously knowing something about height would be really interesting. Things like remote triggers or programmable auto drop-offs, so that we can say in 3 months, we know the battery's going to go flat in 4 months, can you auto drop off, and then can we just walk through the bush and find it? That has its risks, because possums aren't necessarily going to be going on the ground and it may drop off into a tree, but we're more likely to be able to get it, particularly at night. We'll know it'll drop off while they're out foraging, not in a nest box. Katie added this one, triaxial accelerometer. People have these on collars already, so that you can calibrate it with behaviours, and then you can find out from that accelerometer, get some idea of what they're doing. So that's one challenge.
Do the current ones actually drop off?
If you've got a big enough animal, so with cows and horses and elk, bears, no problem. Kangaroos probably too. It costs, but the technology is not available that I know of for something that weighs 2 kilos and where a collar needs to be 70 grams. So because we work on small animals, we've got all these weight constraints. Getting back to just briefly, I spoke at the start about feeding stations. We're interested in which animals go, and we may have 60 feeding stations out there. We can't have 60 collars. It's a huge amount of work to get that on it, or we can't even have 20 or 30 collars. There's a lot of money there. So a cheaper version that Philip and I spoke about, and we did a little bit on a while ago, was more Bluetooth technology. Sorts of questions we're interested in this sort of experiment is not where animals go every 3 minutes, but are they near this feeder? Are they going to the feeder? How close do they get? And if they do come, when are they coming? So we know who's there and what time they're there. And Bluetooth, well, I don't know anything about Bluetooth, but that's a possibility, and let me go through, but they're the sorts of questions, it's more like a proximity logger thing. Again, affordable, if we need, for example, we might need 15 possums with these collars or patches on them. We might have 30 to 60 base stations that we have at the feeders, and what we're interested in, as I said, is who's going there and when at each of these 30 feeders. So again, we don't want to be spending thousands of dollars on this. It's got to work in the bush where there are trees. So if there's a tree here and a possum's coming, or this is a forest, so I don't know whether it's possible, but we don't want interference. We don't want to have the data missed because there was a tree in the way. We'd like to be able to quantify the distance that any possum is that we've got Bluetooth set up on. How far is it from which feeder? Perhaps within a range of up to 50 metres. We want small error close to, because we absolutely need to know whether it was actually at the feeder or 1 metre away. We don't care about the difference between 50 metres away and 30 metres away. See what I mean? So the error can change depending on how close to the base station it is. Again, it's got to be lightweight and waterproof, fit for purpose, rechargeable, and again, remote trigger and programmable. Trade-off.
Would or non-rechargeable batteries be acceptable if they're cheap, sort of less than $30 per battery, and they last?
So just replaceable.
Sure, I guess. I mean, not trying to create endless batteries that we just chuck away. And if it's cheap enough, yes, because it's not as if we'd be using hundreds and thousands of them. Yeah, so that'd certainly be.
Sorry, just some comments. If
Yeah.
okay. A couple of people do very similar things. Like, I don't know if you looked at the koala trackers.
Yeah.
There's a little solar cell on them. And
Yeah.
their lifespan is 2 years.
Well, you see, yeah, these are night animals, and during the day they're in a tree hollow, so the solar doesn't work.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
That screws that.
But yeah,
But in terms of, they're using 900 megs ISM band. So there's people doing this and monitoring entire populations of koalas.
yeah,
And also the other, what you probably should be in touch with, is Australian wool industry, because they're using Bluetooth sheep
yeah.
ear tags.
Yeah, it'd be interesting because, yeah, I mean, and thank you. We know a bit about the koala stuff because I also work on a koala project. We use GPS collars, and we've had a bit to deal with the people developing these things. There always seems to be a gotcha when you actually take it into the field. Not always, but depending on the sort of information you want.
But they've got accelerometers, they're very similar, because
Yeah.
they track in real time because they're getting the data back.
Yeah,
So if they fall out of a tree and dingle themselves, they know from the accelerometer.
yeah, yeah. I'm not saying that this hasn't been developed. I'm saying it's expensive, a lot of it. But yeah, I agree that they're really good ideas.
I'm certainly aware of quite a few groups
Yeah,
doing.
yeah. We've worked a little bit with CSIRO, who've promised waterproof, lightweight, but they haven't quite got there. And yeah, I think with these small animals and they're nocturnal, we've come up with a few weight issues. And actually, I guess the only other slide was it has actually finished, I think. No,
There's another challenge. There's one more slide.
no, that was it.
Oh.
But why isn't it going to my last slide? There it is. It was really just to say thanks to you for coming, but also a lot of my students have done most of this work. I usually sit in the lab and we discuss what they should do, and they're all the techno whizzes, especially Katie, who's done a lot of the most recent radio tracking. So that's it from me, unless you got any other questions.
I've got a question.
Yeah,
Having had Possum Hotel in my room.
yeah. Don't ask me how to get rid of them.
No, I know how to get rid of them.
I don't want to know.
What I want to know is if possums are territorial, when one does move out, another one tends to move in.
Yes.
So why is it moving out of its territory into a new territory?
Oh, it's probably died.
It's probably not.
It's probably died. If one moves out, it's probably died. It probably hasn't moved elsewhere.
It's moved.
You mean it's moved territories because you've made it move?
Oh, if someone else's, if you've moved it, it will probably die because you've taken it elsewhere and the territories are filled. And once you've created a whole, I mean, this is nature. Obviously, they might breed once a year. But if a female lives for 7 years, I mean, unless we're going to have a population explosion, 6 out of 7 of those animals will die. The juveniles will die. So there's a huge cost, as big mortality of juveniles. And then it's really just a replacement thing. So if very unlikely that, actually Cathy, you might know more about this, but very unlikely that the females will move territories unless there's a gap. But usually
Sometimes they avoid each other in time rather than space as well, so they can
Not
have
my
fun
room,
over
they
that.
can.
Yeah.
yeah.
I've now plugged every hole in
You
it.
should build a special home for possum.
Well, we had about 5 of them there at one stage. all
You're lucky. You're lucky.
rattling in the middle of the night.
Feel grateful.
Brushtails and ringtails as well. There's a 2 different species.
If it thumps a lot, it's probably brushtail.
Oh, right. So the funny thing is we had like one of those plastic roofs on the back. And they'd jump out of a tree onto that in the middle and they'd go crash and then
Yeah.
the dogs would go.
Yeah.
And so to plug up the hole, I had to take the whole roof off. And that one night, of course, the possum decided to go to jump onto the roof. And of course, the roof wasn't there.
Dogs ate that night.
I'm sure the possum got quite a shock.
I'm sure it did.
And does
Anyhow,
lights in the attics, does they work at all?
I don't know, but I suspect
The lights so the more of them move in.
the attics are a lovely place for possums. So I suspect they probably just shut their eyes. But
So with your first collars that you're talking about,
yeah,
so they record to an SD card and transmit, do they?
no, it's not an SD card. I'm trying to think what it is.
Oh,
it's
so they record
well,
to something.
yeah,
something,
it's probably a
and
memory chip.
integrated circuit chip.
And
And-
transmit the data.
No. So the second collars we can download through, would transmit through the ultra high frequency
What about
ones.
your, direction finding?
Oh, the VHF
Yeah,
to find
So
them.
the first collars.
Yeah, so
Both of them
that's,
do that.
yeah, both of them do that. So the original, before GPS, the original collars for all this wildlife research was VHF only. And in fact, I had a student years ago, we had 3 caravans set up in northwest Tasmania, 2 kilometres or 3 kilometres apart with radio contact, and every 5 minutes throughout the night, a team of people would be taking a fix from each of those and triangulating to get where these animals were and to track through, we get a fix every hour of 20 animals. And that was the limits. So, it's improved enormously. And there's heaps of things that you can do, given the money, but... Oh, it was. Yeah, they were students, luckily, so they were cheap. Because we could never have afforded it.
So your collars only transmit at night?
Well, you can program them. The VHF, I'm not sure. They may transmit all the time, but I think we had it programmed to only transmit when we thought they'd be out and about, so that we could locate them. Katie will know more about those details. So some of them, these collars can be programmable, and that's fantastic because it saves a huge amount of battery, being able to turn it off when we don't want it.
Because the only thing I was going to say is we had the diagram and the signal was showing way off track there. We get a similar thing happening with APRS.
With that tracking.
Although Although the vehicle will be
it's only...
stationary, the satellite's moving, so you get this friggin'...
Yeah, okay. You can tidy it up.
Ever put one of the collars in a stationary position?
Yeah, that's how we get the error. Yeah, so that's how we understand what the error is likely to be. Yeah, so you can leave it there for...
We do a lot of GPS tracking, and several of us have observed that whilst ever you're moving, it's fairly accurate. As soon as you sit still, it just then starts this...
Well, that's interesting. So it's possible that those errors are appear larger than they actually were, because I have to ask Katie whether she just stuck it in one spot to get those errors. Because that's really interesting.
So if the transmitter battery goes flat, the possum dies with that thing around his neck?
No, we have a weak link, so that which is really, we cut the collar and put a bit of cotton thread around it, and after a few months that will break and it comes off. And we don't put them on juveniles because their necks will be growing, and we don't want to risk that. Yeah. So we have a weak link, not only so that we can get it back after a certain time, but also if they snag it on something and they wheel around enough, it'll break and it'll come off. So yeah, we have to consider that thing.
Collar retrieval service.
Yeah, well, we spent a few $100s with tree climbers and professional tree climbers and chimney sweeps to get those out, but we could see the collar in the chimney, but we couldn't go out and reach it.
You knock on someone's door and say, we believe the possum went down your chimney and left a very expensive collar down there.
We did. And Katie's had to knock on people's doors where the collar's fallen off in their back garden, and they've been lovely and said, yes, come in and look around.
You need a trained ferret.
Yes, we do. Anyway, that's that. I don't know whether it's time for Kath's.
Yeah, we're going to. Shall I go that microphone?
Oh yeah. I think it's on this. I've got the glasses on. How do you want to open this file? You can look after it. Cathy might be able to see that.
Oh, okay. So I'll try to just give you a quick overview on some of the kangaroo research work that we've been doing using technology and, or do I need to press this?
I need to point it at the movie.
Oh, it's got, oh, I see. Yep. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is just go through the research questions and current approaches that we've been taking to the work we've been doing. So what are our current research questions? What's the technology that we currently use, and what are the compromises with that technology? And then look at some of the future research questions and what are the technological requirements and the limitations, both from an animal or an animal welfare point of view, as Claire's already alluded to, and a technology point of view. So if we look at the research questions, we sort of look at them, as Claire was talking about, at different scales. So a lot of what we do is looking at individual animals, and in terms of this, we're often interested in sort of traits that happen throughout their lifetime, so reproduction over time, and also wanting to know sort of when they die, basically, how long are they persisting in the environment, are a couple of the questions there. And we're also interested in looking at their movement patterns, both on a short-term scale and a long-term scale. And then at a population level, we're interested in things like social interactions. How do they interact with other individuals? Are there particular individuals that they're most interested in interacting with? Sort of what is their social structure? Are there sort of how males and females interacting with one another? Sort of are there sort of genetic relationships between individuals and who they're interacting with? And then we're interested in how they interact with their environment. And a lot of what I do relates to human-wildlife conflict. And so in particular, a lot of what we're interested in is how they utilise areas that are in close association with human settlement. So particularly along areas of the east coast of Australia, a lot of the regional centres, we're getting increases in development there, which is basically causing an increase in conflict between kangaroos and people. And so the general approach we've done now, so I've got a few different field sites, but is that we uniquely tag a subset of the population. So in this photo here, you probably can't really see, but almost every individual kangaroo in this photo has a unique combination of ear tags. So they have these sort of left-right ear tag combinations with unique numbers as well. And we do a lot of the really old school sort of, as Claire alluded to, with their shaving of possums as another example there, where we literally go around and we recite animals and we record where they are. We've got sort of these data sheets, which I won't go into, but where they are, who they're with, what their reproductive status is for females because their young's in the pouch nicely. So that's sort of the old-fashioned way, but obviously we've got to get out there with the binoculars and do a lot of that work. So we do this work at the moment at 4 different sites. And again, as I said, it's all on the east coast of Australia. So Nelson Bay on a golf course there. And then we've got 3 sites up on the Coffs Harbour northern beaches. So we've got a kangaroo population on a headland, where they're overgrazing a threatened ecological community. We've got a caravan park and 9-hole golf course where animals are attacking people every now and then we've got another urban development site as well, where there's been quite a number of attacks of cases of kangaroos attacking people and issues with road mortality, and there's some health issues at this site because of their overgrazing. So we do regular population counts, so we can sort of look at the population, how many animals there are, what is the trend over time. We do GPS collaring for a couple of different reasons there. So we have different projects at different points in time and with different aims, similar to how Claire was explaining with the possums there. So sometimes we're interested in how they move in the environment. Do they have a high level of fidelity to a particular site? Do they move between different sites? How connected are different sites? Because this all affects how we manage them and whether we manage small little units or whether we have to manage much bigger populations. And then we're also particularly more interested now in collaring them and getting GPS data to look at how they move in relation to different infrastructure, which is either already existing infrastructure or new infrastructure development projects. So a lot of the sorts of things that I've been talking about here, we can achieve sort of with old school binoculars and getting out there in the field a lot. And some things we can really only tell by being out there looking at animals, and there's sort of GPS technology that we can use for looking at how they move around the environment. But there's a lot of this where we could potentially use some technological approach to look at and to reduce, I guess, workload and person hours in the field, and look at things, say, with using proximity loggers to look at interactions between kangaroos. So, are they in the same place at the same time, to get at some of these social interactions. Reproduction, we pretty much need to be out there looking at survival of young, although we can obviously use some genetic techniques. And we can potentially do a lot more in terms of understanding movement in relation to infrastructure. And some of that's about increasing accuracy or reducing cost. But a lot of it all comes down to scale. Because of the cost at the moment, and Claire, again, scale is sort of a big thing on her list, we can only do a few animals. So I'm sort of talking about doing 8 animals at a time. And some of the things we're wanting to look for may be events that don't happen all that often. So, or there may not be all that many individuals that interact with people in certain ways. So if we can only study 8 individual animals at a time, we don't really have that sort of scale. So we're wanting to sort of try and scale things up so we can get a better idea of variability within the population and some of these different behavioural events that might not occur all that often. But I'll just give you a quick snapshot of one of the projects that we did with Phil a few years ago now, where we looked at putting video cameras on kangaroos and GPS tracking them at the same time so we could see things from a kangaroo's eye view. And so when I say we, Philip and his team pretty much built some collars. Oh, sorry, no, I'm going on to something else first, and then I'm talking about those collars. So in terms of the GPS tracking we've done to date, similar to Claire, we've done had a few different approaches. We've had some custom-built ones which were part of the video tracking project, but were used independent of the video tracking. We've just used some cheap commercial domestic, so the first photo here is just a large male kangaroo sort of with a custom-built unit there. And then we've also been using these little units that are designed for tracking pets or your kids. You put them in their backpack or something, try and figure out where they're going. But these tend to be able to collect data maybe for sort of a week to a month, depending on how many fixes you take at any point in time. And then we've gone through and we've spent more money on some of the more dedicated wildlife units, which cost a lot more money. So this is Nilesor, which was a Polish company, but they've moved somewhere else in Europe. I forget now where they've moved to. And this is on their homepage, actually. So this is one of my kangaroos at that headland site with one of their collars on. And I meant to bring one with me and I forgot. But the advantages of their collars are they're really lightweight and they're solar powered, and their more recent ones can remotely upload data via GSM, actually, I think it is, where you can, is it GSM? Yeah, I think it's GSM. Yeah, and then we can pretty much look at it, and depending how often you set it to collect fixes and to upload the data as to how frequently you can do that. But so the advantage is they're really lightweight. The issues we've been having are just with reliability. So this is a fairly new company, so they've been pretty good at rejigging things. But these collars as well are about €1,000 each. So there's some difficulties there, and we found the same thing with accuracy, particularly if they're stationary. The accuracy isn't great, but the company said the same thing that we just had the discussion about before. If they're moving, their accuracy seems to be better, whereas when they're stationary, they're not as good. But they do have remote download capability. Oh, this is just, so basically their market initially was birds, so they had these little units where they glue on or put on backpacks onto birds and falcons and things. So moving into mammals is a new area for them. But these are some of the types of output that we get. So these are these contour intervals that Claire was talking about that she can do from the possum points as well, where we can look at the trajectory of where the animal's moving at different times. And then here basically the animal's spending 50% of its time in this red zone out to 95% of its time in this sort of darker green area. So we can measure things like where does an animal move, what's their movement trajectory, where are their core areas or their feeding areas, where are they going at different times of day, and their proximity and overlap with different parts of the environment. So in this case, kangaroos were digging on the golf course and creating big holes, which the golfers didn't like. So we're interested in some of their use of different areas of the golf course in relation to those questions. And then we worked with Philip to develop this camera-borne video camera and GPS collar, which was 350 grams, so a bit over around 1.5% of the body weight, with continuous video recording and simultaneous GPS tracking, which gave us that capacity to look at sort of time-matched location and behaviour data, really looking at it from a kangaroo's eye point of view. So it had here, so these aren't the best photos, unfortunately, collar around the neck with the battery unit here. Then on the others, that's a battery unit here. This part here has the camera, GPS and DVR unit in it, and that's just closer up there. We tried mounting the cameras on their heads, and we tried all sorts of glues and shaving their heads and stuff, but then they'd always manage to get it off, and then they'd come back with the camera half broken, and there was ended up being an expensive process there.
Do the collars seem to affect their behaviour?
Some individuals don't tolerate them at all. Like we recollared the same female twice, and she had exactly the same reaction, where they just throw themselves around and try and kick at the collar and stuff. What you'll find sometimes with kangaroos is that in the first 1 to 2 days, and you see this in domestic pets sometimes when you first just put normal collars on, they sort of do this back arching thing, or cats will walk backwards because they feel like they're being pushed down, and so they keep trying to compensate by, reacting. And so it's very much individual to individual
Does it make
animal.
bucks less attractive to does and things like
We
that?
don't know if that's the case, but we do know they have a transient stress response, so an increase in stress hormones in the first 24 hours, but that's settled down by 48 hours after they've had the collars on. They definitely have an impact. The theory is that they sort of equilibrate to them, if you like, or acclimate to them over time. But it's certainly, because obviously we're wanting to measure their natural behaviour, so if we're modifying their behaviour by stressing them out or,
Do the ear tags have a similar effect on them, so that when you whack, obviously cause them a little bit of discomfort punching a hole in their ear and putting a tag in it?
Yeah,
Do
so
they scratch at them and carry on as well?
they don't scratch. One of the things I'd like to do a bit more study on is they possibly do a bit more ear flicking, in terms of just like animal, like we can't flick our ears, but they can sort of flick their ears a little bit. There's other researchers who work on kangaroos who put these big PVC collars that they literally write a name on, and I personally really dislike the collars because they're so big and these are left on the animals. I don't quite know how they deal with juveniles anyway, over time, and they do the ear tags as well, actually. So I've sort of tried for the minimum, but if there was a way to get away from it, that would be great. But at the moment, we've got no other way to identify them individually. So
Like we do put a pit.
yeah, so we put a
we put those in.
a microchip.
Microchip.
Yeah.
But and you can buy expensive readers that if they put their head through, they'll record which animal, but you can't get a signal from a distance.
You can't mount it on their back.
No, there's nothing that'll keep anything on there for any significant period of time.
So you're happy with the collar that is lightweight by the sounds of it? You're happy with that? You're not happy with the price?
I'm not happy with the price, and they've been a little bit unreliable in terms of battery. The battery's going on them when they shouldn't, so I've just sent a whole lot back to them. So their collars are so lightweight actually that I end up having to put a counterweight on them just to basically to keep the solar panels at the back so that they're getting light, but there's heaps of weight to spare. These are really lightweight. Sorry?
You know where they're made?
So they were made in Poland.
Yeah,
Or
but are they made in Poland or are they sold in Poland?
I'm pretty sure the company was based in Poland. They have just moved, hopped across the border somewhere, but I'm terrible with my European.
So you need to dart them to handle them?
Yeah, so we need to dart them to handle them. Yeah. So yeah, so this was sort of a one-off study where we were, so basically, as you can imagine, it's about getting the GPS locations at a bit of a given time and then doing the video analysis and sort of figuring out what they're doing at different points in time. And the video analysis, I'm glad I had students to do that. A whole bunch of footage of kangaroos hopping. And wouldn't be my idea of... yeah.
So the kangaroo collar doesn't have a VHF transmitter to direction find the animal?
The ones I've been using don't, because at the moment the site fidelity is so high we can always just find them. So we're taking a bit of a risk in some ways, but I haven't not been able to get one back. That being said, I do still have one animal out there with one collar on. But
you could probably actually put some sort of pinger on there instead of having a dead weight. The whole animal on the back, you could have a very simple VHF pinger that could be used to find the...
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Be a constructed use of otherwise...
Yeah, because I've just been buying something from the fishing shop, like a sinker, and just...
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. But getting back to the possum one, is it, if you ask the manufacturers what makes it expensive at $3,000 or whatever, is it the transmitter or the GPS unit?
Well, I think we're paying for development.
It's a monopoly.
It's a small market relatively, and the wildlife market.
Yeah, okay.
And so it's development. They do get cheaper and they get better as time goes on.
I'm thinking about what Philip said about how koalas do it too. And I tracked a shark called Trevor, and he was off Sydney and he went up the coast. And I saw the video on YouTube of the thing they put in his fin, and it wasn't real big. And I'm just thinking that surely you'd be better off talking about someone who's already in the tracking field to adapt to your needs rather than starting from scratch again.
Oh yeah, no, we're not asking you to do this stuff. Philip said you might be interested in what we do, and so Kath, for example, have been that's where we go. Yeah. And we acknowledge that, as I said, we always want more.
Yeah,
that's how it works actually with the companies.
Yeah, I don't know how long the one on the shark, the battery lasts on the one on the shark, but it was weeks that I watched it.
I mean, there's always a trade-off, so it all depends. So for a shark travelling tens of k's, accuracy or precision doesn't matter. Yeah. Because whether it's 500 metres or 600 metres is irrelevant, but a possum in 3 minutes may move 100 metres, and for us that matters, so it's a trade-off.
It's a job for an engineer that can do it in 6 months, right? Yeah. And they only need 100 of them, right? This engineer is going to cost $100,000 roughly, right? So 100 of them, then that's $1,000, right? That's only if you have one person working on it. Yeah. And it's just a...
And engineers are always more optimistic than they can deliver.
Careful, Adrian.
But I think a lot of people are in this field.
They are.
See, what you want to do is leverage off those ideas.
Yeah, and I think as well that, there are some big budget projects and some species that tend to attract bigger budgets as well than others. So it's a matter of, you hear a lot of we hear a number of individual stories about the really good successful things. You don't hear about all the ones that failed and didn't work as well. So so from this we could look at what they were doing and how often they were standing and feeding and walking and hopping and that sort of thing. And we could look at what plants, when they were foraging, what things they positively selected for versus the things they avoided and didn't eat. So it gives you a different perspective, whereas you can do this again in the field just with a pair of binoculars, but you're quite biased in that you only see where you're watching them. You don't see what they're doing and what they're eating and stuff in other areas where you can't unobtrusively observe them. So, so we can look... Sorry? But I know some of the things they were interested in. the take-home story was kangaroos eat grass, woohoo, you know, who knew? But we can look, you know, at all of these other things. It was about sort of looking at the technology and how it could be used in different ways. And we could do sort of maps as well of saying where are they resting versus where are they feeding, which again you could potentially do using accelerometers as well if you had sort of coded that and knowing what the accelerometer pattern looks like for different behaviours.
Actually, those mini cameras for possums.
Yeah.
So are kangaroos territorial?
No, so they have big social groups. So yeah, social interactions. So we sort of saw a lot of head down looking at grass and other plants that we probably didn't really think they'd be as interested in. Surprisingly, we didn't see as many social interactions as I thought we would for a social species, and even ones that had ear tags. A colleague of mine was interested in the foraging. I was more interested in social interactions and the like. But you know, these are all photos taken by a kangaroo, so that's kind of cool. Kangaroo can. That's exactly what we called it. But sort of moving on to some of the research questions. Really interested in kangaroo movement in relation to human infrastructure. So this is one of our sites here. This is just a Google Earth map back in time. Now I don't have a caption here and I've got a mental blank. This is maybe 2008 or 2010. This is the site where we've been doing a lot of work here. So back then the Pacific Highway was a 2-lane single carriageway. This is a site now, and there's even more houses there now, and it's on to dual carriageway, at least 2 lanes in each direction, then a minor local road. Most of it's fenced in most places. There are some underpasses where there's a creek here. It's not an official underpass, it's just that there happens to be a creek there, but there are some other ones. But my suspicion is that they're not using these at all, which I think is going to be a big issue down the track. For example, some of our tracking, and again, this is just raw points similar to Clare's possums. This is one female over 3 months with those solar panelled ones. You can see that the females in particular aren't crossing the roads. So what we're doing things like looking at their home range, where they're moving, but we're also like counting how many times they're crossing the road and looking at differences between males and females, etc. And then also in many times linking that back to, that male crossed the road 8 times a day and then he was dead 4 months later on the side of the road type thing, to look at some of those questions. But one of the big issues for us, I think, is whether the new M1 is a barrier to east-west movement, and that's particularly an issue because this is the Coffs Harbour Kangaroo Management Plan. All of these colours are different kangaroo populations. The black line here is the M1. Most of these populations are all on the eastern side. They've all already got issues of conflict between kangaroos and people. And if we're limiting east-west dispersal, then we're potentially going to have a big issue. This site actually is on the western side here, but we've got 2 other sites on the eastern side as well.
The earlier one?
No, so this is a problem. We don't have any before and after data. So they're planning a bypass. So in some places the habitat is not suitable on both sides, and other places it is. And what we've done is we've put some tracking collars as well. There's one section where the old highway is separate from the new motorway, and we've put some collars on animals on the side of the old highway just to get an idea of how much they're crossing that as a comparison. But obviously traffic volume is different because it's not ideal, but it's...
So Cathy, saying that underpasses, habitat underpasses are being put in, but they're not being used.
No, they're not official.
No, but there are some official ones. The problem from a kangaroo's point of view is they're not designed for kangaroos. They're designed for koalas and quolls and bandicoots, which is great. So I suspect it's got to be